Hi everyone, welcome back. So this week I wanted to talk a little bit more about something I referenced in one of our earlier video lectures. I believe it was the one, like the syllabus lecture, in which I referred to academic writing as its own genre of writing. So I wanted to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of this. So first of all, what is genre? So genre, very, very simply put, means a type or a kind of something. To put a little bit more nuance on this though, to get a little bit more into the specifics of how genre works, genre very specifically refers to a type or kind of something that shares a certain set of characteristics that have been established over time and are easily recognizable and accepted by certain audiences. These sets of conventions allow for a certain degree of predictability within the genre and fulfill a set of established expectations for an audience. So what this means when we're thinking of genre a little bit more wholesale, most major, usually like in the arts and things like that, can be categorized by genre. So if we think of music, for example, there are all kinds of genres of music. There's rap and R&B and rock and roll and indie music and alternative. So those are all genres of music. And when we say those things, we can probably get an idea in our head when I say rap music of what that kind of music will generally entail. If I say pop music, you probably have an idea in your mind of what kind of sounds you might hear or how the flow of the music might go. This is kind of true of other genres as well. Books, there's fiction and nonfiction, and those are like really broad genre categories, each of which has sort of their own subgenres. And then, if we talk about, say, television shows, there's dramas and soap operas and teen rom-com series, and so there's a variety of different kind of genres within each of those, right? That you might that probably give you an idea in your head of what to expect if you were to watch any of those genres, right? So when we're going back like to the film example that I was talking about in that initial video, I mean, even film, right, has its own genres within it. There's horror films and gangster films and romantic comedies and superhero films, right? Because each genre is sort of made up of fairly standard pieces, each of you probably has a pretty good idea when I say those things, horror film, gangster film, etc. You probably have a pretty good idea in your head approximately what you're going to get yourself into if you watch one of those, right? If I said, for example, I'm going to go watch a romantic comedy, you all will probably assume that the plot is going to involve two characters that meet each other and then they fall apart somehow or lose touch with one another, but then they realize that person was the love of their life, and then they have to go through some obstacles before finally they end up together, right? I mean, granted, there might be some differences in some of the details of how those things play out within the film, like who the characters are, what their jobs are, how they meet, how they come to the point where they realize that they love each other, right? But some of those like core details are usually present if we're talking about a romantic comedy, right? But each genre has basically these overarching conventions that are unique to, but also define it as a genre, right? Now, even within a standard genre, there might also be subgenres, right? So, for example, if I said I'm going to watch a horror film, granted, there's going to be probably scary things that happen in there and whatever. And that's probably like one of the big generalities of a horror film, is it's meant to scare the audience. But there are different kinds of horror films, right? So there's like monster flicks. I'm thinking like, Godzilla or The Thing or, you know, stuff like The Blob, you know? But there's also like slasher films, so like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, like Freddy Krueger and Jason, you know, Michael Myers and, you know, those sorts of deals, Texas Chainsaw Massacres, right? So that's blood and guts and gore and some central, you know, figure that does the killing usually, right? There's hauntings or ghost stories. There's psychological thrillers, right? So all of these are sort of subgenres within the overarching genre of horror films, right? So even within those subgenres, there are certain aspects of them that, you know, sort of codify them as a certain kind of horror film, right? And as I said before, this sort of idea of genre and then subgenre is true within a variety of, you know, different, usually artistic expressions, right? And I think it's fair to think that writing has its own set of genres and subgenres. Academic writing, which is what we are going to be working on in this class, is arguably a genre of writing, and it has its own subgenre or subgenres that work into that. So the subgenres of academic writing might be essays and reports and case studies or book reviews or literature reviews or research papers, right? And some of the, you know, kind of common conventions of like academic writing more generally might be, you know, you usually write in the third person, right? There's no I, me, my, no you, right? You usually avoid that kind of language in more academic formal papers. There's usually the use of some sort of standard citation style. In this class, we're using the Modern Language Association or MLA citation formats. Most of the time, once you get to English 203, which is the class that you usually take after you pass this one, most instructors teach APA in that class or American Psychology Association citation style. There's also Chicago Manual style, for example. So there are a variety of citation styles that you might run into or that might be standard for certain academic fields and things like that. But in academic writing, usually you will have some sort of academic citation style that you're sticking to within a paper that you're writing or a piece that you're writing. Primarily, academic writing is based on use of logic and reason. Usually academic writing is devoid of like personal opinion or appeals to emotion, things like that. Mostly academic writing should be, there's a fly. Academic writing should be written in a way that puts logic and reason at the forefront, okay? So basically factually based rather than opinion based for the most part on academic writing. Now, there might be some exceptions to that, you know, book reviews, for example. In some instances, after you do a research paper, you might apply based on your expertise, you might provide some opinion about what some research means, but it's always, if you're going to apply some sort of opinion, it's an educated opinion, right? So it's based on the knowledge that you have of the field before. It's not just like, well, I feel this is probably the way it goes, right? It's based on the knowledge that I have. My opinion on this is X, right? So even if you do give opinions, it's usually grounded in some kind of education or knowledge that you have of something, right? Or around something. So each of the different subgenres that you might come into contact with as far as academic writing goes, so like book reports or book reviews or research papers or essays or, you know, whatever, some of those are going to have sort of standardized pieces to them. And most of the time, if you are working within a certain academic field. So like if you're in an English department or if you are in a biological sciences department, a lot of times like the sciences or the humanities or whatever might have sort of specific kinds of sections that you might find in a research paper for that field, right? And then the last thing that I'm going to mention in terms of expectations or common conventions of academic writing is use of standard English. Now, on this point of standard English, I would like to also bring up the concept called code switching. So code switching is when a speaker or a writer switches between varieties of language. So for those who are multilingual, for example, this might mean switching between English and whatever your second language is, or sometimes it's a combination of those things. So if there's an English and Spanish speaker who's like speaks those two languages, sometimes there's like sort of this thing called Spanglish where they'll speak like a combination of English and Spanish together. Sometimes they'll speak one or the other, etc. So that's one kind of code switching. The other would be switching between varieties within a single language. So there are varieties of English that are more formal and there are varieties of English that are less formal. So just as an example of this, when I call my sister and it's just the two of us on the phone, most of the time when she answers the phone, I will say, "Hey girl, hey," just like that because we're weirdos. But if I were to say, call my grandmother, I might be like, "Hi, Granny," right? Or if I'm in a more professional setting and I'm calling a colleague, I might say, "Good evening, Dr. Smith," right? So you'll notice that there are degrees of formality, right? The kind of language I use, the words I use, the tone I use, depending on who I'm with. Those are examples of code switching, right? So what we do as humans is we tend to recognize that certain kinds of language or tones of our voice or the way that we present language are more or less acceptable in different sorts of situations, right? It's situational, the way that we use language. Academic writing is a form of formal communication. And the expectation is typically that formality is reflected in the way that we approach writing tasks. Now, I will state for the record that there are a lot of classist connotations, for example, embedded in the formality of academic writing. And I try and keep this in mind as I teach this class and as we work through different exercises and things like that. But it is important for you to understand that the expectations that many of your professors will likely have regarding adherence to formal language. If you turn in an essay where you're being super informal, using lingo that is not formal, but rather more indicative of, something that you might conversationally have with your friends, or using terminology that isn't formal, things like that, there is a possibility that the instructors and the teachers that you have throughout your college experience are going to call you out on that, and they're going to dock you points for that, etc. And you need to know that this is a possibility, despite the fact that, again, there are absolutely classist connotations in the idea of formality of language. Now, I think of myself more as a descriptivist. Now, what that means is when I talk about use of language and things like that, I am more prone to describe how people are using language rather than prescribing or dictating rules. So prescriptivist is sort of the opposite of a descriptivist. Prescriptivists prescribe rules, or they adhere to rules. When you're writing for an academic audience, you are probably going to be expected to adhere to more prescriptivist rules. it is, I mean, it is what it is. We can fight the power all we want, but it is kind of what it is sometimes. And this is something that you're going to have to probably contend with. It's something that I had to learn to get around and things like that when I was going through, you know, these English sort of courses in my early days of academic writing. And so you're going to have to sort of learn to code switch probably a little bit. So keep that in mind, right? The way that you write for an academic paper is probably not going to be the same sort of language that you might informally use with your best friends or your close family members or things like that. It's probably going to be it's a much more structural, more formal mode of communication. So all of that said, one of the things that we will be working on throughout this class, and probably by extension when you get into English 203 after you pass this class, is familiarizing you with the conventions of this genre of academic writing. That's kind of like one of the main purposes of you taking this class and the next English 203, which will be again after 103, which is this class. And it's to sort of help you get through, you know, understanding what those conventions are as far as writing expectations and things like that, and making sure that you're ready to produce writing of that sort of formal variety. So I'm confident, as with all of my students in the past, you guys are going to learn a lot. Are you going to come out of this class like perfect? No, I don't think any of my students ever do. I still don't think I'm perfect at this. But it's a process to learn, and you will get better at it as you work through it. And so yeah, academic as a form of genre of writing, again, you're going to be learning a lot of things, the ins and outs of it, you know, so sort of what the conventions of this kind of formal writing are, etc., throughout this class. But it is it's important, I think, for you to understand it as a genre that has certain expectations and conventions that are learnable, and we'll get through it as we go through the class. But if you have questions about things like this and whatnot, of course, feel free to let me know, and we will address those issues as they come up. Okay? All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.